All right, everybody. So now we are in week 6 of Old Testament literature. And the main thing we're going to be doing throughout the rest of the course is trying to answer the question, how do we read the biblical text? Trevor Longman in his book is going to explore different passages and give his explanation for how we should read these and how he will kind of look at the literary evidence. And I'm just going to kind of compare and contrast some of that evidence with my own reading of these same biblical texts. We won't go through all of them, but we will look at a lot of them. So for now, we're going to start on narrative text that he pulls from the Torah. And he also does some from Kings, First Kings, and Samuel, but we're not going to focus on those in this lecture. Just make sure to read that in the textbook. So let's go ahead and get into reading some of the biblical text. Just as a broad reminder, remember, Tremper started the book off with talking about theory, about how we need to look at these biblical texts as literature based on the theories from modern literary analysis and theories that kind of, in a sense, derive themselves from the Bible itself. So Tremper is going to argue that there is a certain sense where you can read through the Bible and then start to notice certain things that are in common about certain passages and then put those passages into the same genre category. And then those genre categories are going to have certain rules by which you need to read them. And if we follow those rules correctly, we understand the text better, versus if we don't follow those rules correctly, we understand the text worse. So he's moving from that sort of theory standpoint to the actual practice of how we need to go through reading these biblical texts. And in his practice, he explores several texts. Obviously, there are so many issues around Genesis 1 and 2 that's always worth talking about. He also spends more time on Genesis 3, which is where we'll spend a lot of our time here in a moment as well. Then he has an excursus on Genesis 6 through 9, and the same thing with Genesis 22, where he goes into a discussion of that, but then he has an excursus on that. And then he ends with a short discussion of Exodus 1. And to be honest, in some ways, I felt like that could have been excluded from this portion of the book altogether because it doesn't really apply anything other than just doing a quick overview of Exodus 1 and then ending the chapter. So in his conversation of Genesis 1, Tremper Longman is going to argue that it's fictive narrative, meaning that it's a historical account told in a fictive sort of way so that you don't take it literally. I could try to quote his exact words here. He's going to say, yeah, I seek to justify my conclusion that the author intends for readers to understand that historical events are being described in figurative language, meaning they don't want you to take it literally. And one of the examples he's going to use from Genesis 1 is the creation narrative. So he's going to say, it's long been recognized that the days of creation, of the creation week, have an interesting literary relationship with each other. The first 3 days describe the creation of realms, and the second 3 days provide inhabitants to fill those realms. So sun, moon, and stars of day 4 fill the realm of light and darkness in day 1. And the birds and fish of day 5 fill the sky and seas of day 2. The birds and animals the animals and humans of day 6 fill the land of day 3. And this would be a chart to look at that. This is not the same exact one that Tremper uses, but it's very similar. So he's going to go on to make this sort of conclusion here. He's going to say that this presentation of the creation is not intended to give an actual sequence of creation. It's confirmed by the fact that the second creation account presents a different order of creation. Therefore, God creates the first human before the emergence of vegetation and before the animals whom God presents to the first human to name. Some modern translations try to solve this, and he's going to get into that, but he's going to say that that's kind of wrong. So then he's going to say, kind of at the end of this, the actual creation sequence is not intended here. Instead, it is sort of a figurative language approach. Now, I am going to acknowledge with Tremper that there is a theological intention for how creation is being described in Genesis 1 that's not about the actual sequence of creation as much as it's about how God is assigning everything. But I'm not going to go so far to say that it's figurative, as if it's not saying anything that's happening here is really related to how it happened back then. I don't think that that's necessarily the case. So let me show you what I'm getting at. So here's what I'd say is really happening in Genesis 1. What you're getting is in Genesis 1:1, I think that verse is saying that God created the universe. So it says, in the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth, heavens and the earth is a merism to mean in the beginning, God created the entire universe. And that's the big, sphere I have here on the screen. And so after God creates the whole universe, he goes through the universe and assigns roles to the universe as to what they need to do. And the purpose of Genesis 1 is to explain to us what the role of everything is. So on day 1, he explains what light and darkness are supposed to do. Day 2, the sky and the seas. And day 3, what the land is supposed to do. Exactly what its purpose is. And specifically, I do think it's not talking about what the whole earth is supposed to be doing. I do think it's talking about what the land that God's people is supposed to live on is supposed to do. And then in days 4, 5, and 6, it fills those foundational realms, like Tremper Longman is going to talk about, and explains what the things inside of those realms are supposed to do. So just like light is supposed to divide itself from darkness, well, the sun, moon, and stars are supposed to help us navigate how to live in the light, and how to avoid, in a sense, living in dark times, because those are not times where we're going to have festivals and events and things like that. Instead, we're going to be resting and trusting in God. So the same thing happens on day 5, same thing with day 6. And then what you'll notice is humans are singled out in day 6 in a way that the rest of creation is not. And so I think this is related to the hierarchy of sort of top-down creation that God has in mind here. God is above everything here. So let me just go ahead and highlight that. God is above everything. And then you have first the sun and a moon and stars. So the things that are kind of in the atmosphere from our perspective. And then you kind of narrow that down to, okay, the things that are, or I should have said the things that are above our atmosphere here. And then you have it narrowed down to the things that are in our atmosphere. So once again, the things that kind of fly in the sky above us. And then you have it narrowed down even more to the things that actually live on the land for the most part. And I should have clarified here on day 2 what I meant when I said things that are above, like the things that surround human beings, in a sense, the things that are above us in the sky, the birds, and the things that are beneath us in the water, the fish. Is kind of the point of the second day. But notice that's also true of the sun, moon, and stars, right? The sun and the moon are above and kind of underneath us as the earth is rotating around in the universe. But then, kind of right in the middle there are the animals and humans, once again. And the point is, we are intentionally sandwiched in between these things. And you can almost say that this is going from things that seem to be of the greatest importance and freedom and things that have the least. So the sun, is so hot that we can't even be on it. There's all kinds of birds and fish like whales and eagles and things like that are, in a sense, much freer than us. They can move wherever they want. We can just about not kill whales, especially the really, really big ones. They're just very dangerous for us to be around. And then to, other animals that are also, can have like that, like elephants and stuff like that. But we've learned how to kind of tame some of that to humans ourselves, who, in a sense, maybe, especially when we started off, the weakest of this group. And so humans are then singled out, like I have here in my arrow, to have dominion over all of these other things that seem to be better than them. And our dominion is because we're created in the image of God, not because we have the power of God, but because God himself allows us to do that. But notice here, that the dominion that God gives us is not the dominion over everything. It's only dominion over certain things. So we can rule over the second and the third things, right? So we're going to rule over things that are in the land and things that are in the sky and the sea, but we're not given any dominion over the sun, moon, and the stars. We still have to follow kind of the trajectory of the sun and moon and the stars while we're living here on the earth. And so the whole point of Genesis 1 in the sequencing is related to the sort of top-down creation model that as you get more specific, things become more and more kind of constricted. God has restricted us to certain things, and then that restriction on us, God allows us to rule over other things as long as we're keeping those in those patterns and restrictions for which they were created. We need to now guide and govern them to do what God wants them to do. So in the same way that the sun, moon, and the stars are for seasons and times and constantly reflect the glory of God, we now have to mold and continue to produce creation to do that same sort of thing. And so Longman's figurative reading of Genesis also moves into his reading of Genesis 3. And lest you think I completely disagree with everything Longman has to say, I do want to point out some of the good things he has to say about some of the stuff happening there. So, for example, he points out how the serpent's statement is ridiculous on the surface, because if man and woman could not eat from any tree in the garden, they would have starved. So there should have been some points there that Eve should have pointed out or should have caught on to from the serpent to say, this is just trying to trick me because God did not want us to starve. And then he also points out really correctly that Eve adds to the divine prescription that by claiming that God said you must not touch it, which God did not say. I think that's a very good observation to make there as well. And then, he points out here, though, once again, knowledge of good and evil is, once again, actual figurative language that he doesn't emphasize here about how someone comes to learn independence in Scripture. So, like if you look at in the beginning of Deuteronomy, that's them learning sort of independence, and it says those who are under the age of 20 don't know independence; those above do. So we could get back into that some later. But then he's going to point out here correctly that to know in this context is also related to a knowledge that is not intellectual but experiential, meaning they don't know good and evil in the sense that they haven't experienced it because they haven't lived independent from God in order to know this. They've lived dependent on God. And so they only know the sort of goods and evil that God has exposed them to. So they don't know everything that's great yet, which I think God was going to teach them, but they also don't know anything that's evil yet because God has not allowed them to encounter that, and them going out on their own means they're going to encounter that in their own way. Still, there are a few things that Longman says that I do think are worth commenting on. So he says, that God apparently has some sort of limited knowledge here, which is one of the reasons he's going to say this is sort of figurative, because obviously God doesn't really have limited knowledge. So when God says, where are you? He's going to say, okay, God is trying to sort of act like he doesn't know, or is being personified as if he doesn't know. And so therefore the author doesn't want you to take this literally. But he forgets that the call here is a lament. A cock means to like lament at where someone is. So it's not saying like, where are you? It's just like, oh, where are you? Like, what's happening? Like, oh, this is an anguishing sound. And you can find this also in Lamentations 1:1 over and over again in the book of Lamentations, that this is more of like, oh, what is happening in a sort of lamenting way, not a, I don't really know where you are. The next thing is Trimper does, and this is a common sort of interpretation, so it's not unique to Trimper Longman, that the serpent has legs and walked, because it says that you should crawl on your belly and you should eat dust. But that more or less is a figurative way of saying that he's going to be defeated. So you could like read here in Isaiah 49:3, kings shall be your foster fathers, and your queens your nursing mothers, and their queens are, with their faces to the ground, which is the same thing as crawling on your belly. They shall bow down to you and lick the dust of your feet, the same thing as eating dust, licking dust. And they shall, and then you will know that I am the Lord. Those who wait for me shall not be put to shame. So the point here of crawling on your belly, eating dust, is to say that you're going to utterly be defeated. That's a figurative way of saying that in Genesis 3, and this section of it is poetry as well. And so while I agree with Longman that there is figurative language, I don't think everything is figurative or that the whole narrative is figurative. I think there's just a narrative that has figurative language in it. So we'll end our time together as we always do, talking about Ryken's analysis here. We're going to switch into poetry a little bit ahead of time before we start looking at some of the poetic text next week. And so he's going to have this discussion of lyric poetry. So he's going to say a lyric poetry is a short poem that expresses the feelings of the poet. And one of the things he's going to say about that, which I find interesting, is that the idea is that in the same way that you can't have a high level of emotion for a long amount of time, you'll just burn out on that. That's kind of the same point of a lyric poem, is that it's going to spur you to emotion in short ways and sort of with quick brevity, such that you'll be moved and then quickly kind of move on to another emotion, because once again, high intense emotions don't last for very long. You can kind of think about this when you have your adrenaline really high, and your adrenaline, might spike up for a minute because you feel like you're about to be attacked by something, but then here soon it will resolve itself, and then you feel exhausted afterwards. Well, lyric poetry is meant to do the same thing. He's going to say most of the time when people think about poetry, they're thinking about lyric poetry, and that every other sort of form of poetry is a subcategory of that. So once again, the main elements of this are going to be brevity, a central theme that connects fragments together. So otherwise, it seems like there's just all of these different statements. But as you get focused on the central theme, you can see how all of those pieces fit together. So it's going to be personal and subjective. And then he's going to say it has this sort of three-part structure, where it's going to talk about the theme, develop the theme, and the theme and its development can happen in a variety of different ways. So it can just tell you what the theme is. It can tell you about an occasion. It can just begin the section with a statement, and then all of the other statements follow underneath that. And then that's going to be developed through either repetition or citing examples or contrasting it with other emotions so that you can focus on what the main emotion is. And then that's going to end with a concise concluding statement about what the theme was.